So I walk into the bathroom, and there, hanging from the shower curtain, was a stainless steel hook.
Tales of the Hook. I see.
Yeah,
Was there anything behind the curtain?
yeah, maybe some mildew.
No one with a no knives.
Yeah, no
Like
domestic psychos here.
you live a pretty quiet life with
Yeah.
that hook of yours. Well, it's interesting you should bring up the hook because you know it kind of, I don't know if you planned this or not, but it kind of segues beautifully into the reading we did this week, Tales of the Hook, which is a chapter from Stephen King's 1983 book of criticism. And I don't know if you've written many others, but this was kind of a Stephen King at the height of his popularity. And he wrote a pretty big book about like what horror means to him, and also like a kind of a guidebook for writers.
Yeah, yeah. I really like the way he comes up with that typology of terror, horror, and revulsion in the chapter. Terror being, purely the imagination, and horror has the imagination in it, but then you see it as well. And revulsion is really just a reaction to, an image, a scene, something like that.
Yeah, it's interesting too. I mean, one of the things about the book is it's a much longer argument, a broader argument than what we're making, but he wrote it in 1983, and it says, or it's noted that a lot of it came from his own college courses and his own career and his notebooks about stuff he learned. And the idea is he wanted to write this book about horror without what he calls, quote unquote, the academic bullshit. So like he does break things down into a very kind of like a simple theoretical model, right? At the same time, though, there's a little bit of resentment in there because here's, the most popular author possibly of all time, right? The best-selling author of all time. And he is absolutely shunned by the Academy. And I would say, 30 years later, he's still absolutely shunned by the Academy. The idea of you're reading Stephen King or you're watching Stephen King, remarkably, is still an issue. But I wonder how much of that also plays into his writing of the book, but also the way in which he moves completely to the other side of kind of academic prose. And it's part of what I think is great about his writing is he always pulls you in, and it's always very quotidian and how you doing, buddy? You got a cigarette? Let me tell you a story.
Yeah. I wonder if that doesn't play into some of the like class type issues that you see coming through some he goes to college and tries to sell his meteor,
Yeah, and the way in which the professor is looked upon, like it's just such a figure of authority, but also of horror. And it's interesting, and it comes up again. Like you can think of that as a pair story with The Crate, where you have these academics, right? And they sit around and they're all very proper, and Billy is pissing everybody off and talking about, I just think he should go get laid. That's the problem. And get his ashes hauled, I think is one of the actual terms she uses. And there's that crazy moment in Creepshow, written by Stephen King, his homage to the EC comics, to the whole kind of era of comics that he grew up with, or was at least inspired by. And he has that moment where Hal Holbrook, who plays the kind of browbeaten husband, stops in the middle of a party, pulls out like a Dirty Harry gun and shoots her in the head. And everybody stops and they applaud slowly. And he's kind of like happy. And, it's a horrific scene of violence in many ways. And the question of how women are represented in Creepshow certainly needs to be examined. But there's also that moment where the horror is seen as normal and kind of you're in that situation where you have to kind of adjust to the almost comic, tone of Creepshow. And it's interesting because you marry two masters of horror. You marry George Romero, Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead. I mean, the zombie movie king, like in some ways more influential to our aesthetic of storytelling now than any other director. You have him, Walking Dead is a direct lineage to Romero. And then you have King, who kind of tongue-in-cheeks and can be funny, but again is a master of the horror novel and the horror short story. And they come together and they make a black comedy. Like they actually make a story that's more comic than it is horror.
Yeah, it is. I was surprised the extent to which they play it for laughs,
Yeah.
I mean, like, I don't know if Stephen King has that to him. Romero, kind of, but I think he keeps it much more subtle than Creepshow does.
I mean, and it comes out, it can come out in all sorts of ways. Like just the Stephen King character. And I have an animated GIF, and I'll see if I can bring this up. But just the Stephen King character himself is so comic within this story. And let me just see if I can get this to go. But I'm going to bring this up now. But his character's awesome. I love his character because of the way he plays it and how out of control it is. So let's see if we can do that. Do you see that?
Yeah.
And this is him with his. All right. So let's see if you can see that. Yeah. So there he is, and he's just kind of matching his face, and he's so overplays it, right? And he's so over the top, and the meteor shit, and he talks about his fingers and all that stuff. I mean, it's just the Stephen King moment in that. It's just so amazing for me. And it's also like, you're watching this in the 80s, which I was, probably 82, because it was extremely successful as a movie. And you get to see this, personage, this, really this star, even though a star of a literary star or a pop novel star in the flesh. And it's unique to see him forefronted as a character in his own story. So I love that part about this.
Yeah. And there's a thing that he does where he combines, the real world horror with the supernatural, or in that case, more like science fiction, I guess. But in that story, he's like, isolated, alone, the disease, I guess, is in there as well, and it's going throughout his work. So you get those two levels, and it really, plays upon the reader, the viewer.
Well, it's interesting too. I mean, if we take that case of the meteorite and the grass, like the great thing about that for me always, as I remember that episode, was the end. Right? Like the end is so amazing because you see him go through the full transformation from yokel to swamp thing. And then he kills himself and like there he is. But it's the end where you have that little TV saying, and we're going to get, 30 days of rain and it's going to be spectacularly green in this part of Maine. And then you see the grass making its way to Castle Rock or Portland or Bangor. And there's that sense of what's next. Like there's that unbelievable horror of what's going to come and what's going to be seen and what's unseen. And, King doesn't get enough credit for how much he plays that, like his endings and his ability to kind of compound the horror of the story by suggesting what else is. I mean, it's overdone in The Crate where the thing breaks out and then you don't know it's going to be done, but like it's absolutely perfect in the one with the meteor and the grass taking over the entire, obviously maybe world, continent, town, whatever. I just love that because it's also very subtly apocalyptic, right? But it's almost like an apocalypse of green, like a green apocalypse, like a kind of reclaiming of the earth in some strange way. But for me, that's one of the the points of these stories that really stuck with me is his ability to end stories and end them in a way that's both punctuated, but far more horrifying than anything that came before it. I lose you, Paul?
And what else do we have in there? The crate.
Something to tide you over.
Yeah, that one. Yeah, okay. So that has the zombies in it, which is, George Romero's zone.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And talk about playing it for laughs. You've got like Leslie Nielsen and Ted Danson, two like
exactly
TV clowns, basically.
I can bench 300 foot. I can bench press 300 pounds if you get your foot out of the door. Like, I love that line. But the whole thing too, like, and I was watching The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly this weekend, so I'll come back to that reference. But there's that whole thing for me to tide you over. Something to tide you over is my favorite episode, bar none. And it's my favorite episode because it did things that I think both Romero and King do really well. And that's this: when they're telling stories, they tie it to a deep horror fear, right? Like the idea of being buried alive, or at least buried up to your neck and then drowned and being unable to move and just stuck. Even the scene when the crab comes by is horrific because, like, it's just a simple thing. He kicks it away, but it's horrific. But then you tie that to jealousy or ownership, and then to technology, like at the time in 1981 or 82 when this film was being produced, was radical. The VCR monitor and closed circuit video. I mean, the idea of watching your loved one drown, and being helpless to the point where you're about to go through the same process and capture that on TV is a really, really crazy vision. And it's a horrific vision, but like we've talked about with King, and I think it's on Romero too. You can say that with Dawn of the Dead. Like, you have these zombies, but they're in a mall. Like, they're very much planted within our culture shopping, right? I think King and Romero come together beautifully in this episode because you have the horror of the buried alive. You have the horror of them looking. It really does harken back to the EC comics for this twisted, psychotic vision. But then you have this technology. So I'm going to share this with you quickly because I have it. This is the one I have of the TV and Ted Danson and him being kind of basically buried alive. So let's see if I can get this, because this is, absolutely my favorite of all of them. And it's not the best. A lot of people love the cockroaches. One, like, that's a lot of people. That's the one they love. But for me, without question, it's this one. So let me get here and I'm just going to have to go to my desktop and start a screen share. You're going to see something you don't want to see there for a second, but here it is. Let's see if I can get this thing to go. Oh, sorry.
I saw for a second.
There it is. You see that?
Yeah.
I mean, I just love that idea of Ted Danson buried to his head. And, it would be technically, if I was doing it better as a GIF, that's a GIF I made years ago. If I was doing that better, it would be actually his girlfriend at the time or his lover. And there's that truly haunting idea. Comes to the end, right? You have Leslie Nielsen himself buried. And it's this comic idea. I can hold my breath for a long time. And what if, anyone who wants to geek out on Stephen King, and I do, I've read a lot of Stephen King. I enjoy Stephen King a lot. But he writes in his introduction to The Dark Tower, he writes about, am I saying that right? Hold on. He writes about watching The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. and how that was the inspiration for his Western, right? And one of the things that he notes, and I was just interested, is he's saying he was really blown away by The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And one of the things that he says that I think is interesting is, Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, done by Sergio Leone, famous spaghetti Western, and you have the ugly, Tuco, saying to the good, which is the great Clint Eastwood, saying basically, you can make out of, Clint Eastwood says it to Tuco, and then Tuco says it back to Clint Eastwood later on in the movie. He says, you can make it out of the desert. You just gotta hold your breath. You just gotta be able to save your breath because you gotta walk 60 or 70 miles. So it's basically he's killing him, right? I mean, that's the idea. Is like he's not gonna make it out of the desert. And I really believe that King, and I tried to get King on Twitter and ask him, like, were you influenced by this? And he obviously ignored me. But I'm fascinated by this idea that, he's maybe hearkening back to another horror. And it's horror embedded within the Western genre, but this horror of being, basically set out to die, right? Put on a mission where you can't possibly survive a 70-mile walk in the desert, in the middle of nowhere, that isolation, that horror. So I'm wondering how much he's pulling from other things, but even just that vision of the horror of getting back, the retribution of it.
Yeah, because you get that helplessness, that Ted Danson has when he's buried up to his neck. Similar to the helplessness that Tuco has when he's got the rope around his neck, standing on top of that wooden tombstone.
It's awesome. Absolutely.
Yeah, like one little slip and he's done for.
And it's interesting too, because The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly plays funny too. Like it plays over the top, like Creepshow, and a very different kind of movie, but genre based and definitely over the top. And I think Creepshow is a genre based, over the top film, but it's also a cult classic, or a classic. I mean, many people consider it one of the better horror films because it plays across so many different registers potentially, because there are some really deeply frightening parts of it, like being buried up to your neck and, having tide come in and burying you. But then there's some also very funny, like irrelevant parts, but also there's this thing that runs always through King, and I imagine through Romero too, actually, if you think about it. Although Romero is a little bit more keyed into questions of race and gender than I think some of King's work is. But the idea is class. Class is always like, you got this rich guy, right, who's wants his possessions, right? This is all about his possessions. I don't love her anymore, but she was mine, right? And he's got this beautiful house with all these cameras, and he's really wealthy. And, the same goes with Father's Day. You got this really rich bootlegger and this rich family who are all pretty despicable, right? You don't feel bad for any of them. It's just like this ugly world. And gosh, the final one, where you have the cockroaches and you have this rich businessman who's basically laughing when, the widow of someone who killed themselves because he had taken over their company calls. He's like, well, he couldn't do his job and he was useless. And, just basically like, sand in the wound, or salt in the wound. And he's this figure, ultimately he gets his due. But
he's very much like a Howard Hughes type character, right? Who isolated himself to avoid all kinds of germs, and I don't know, that's why that segment is really creepy to me. That, like, not just the bugs, but the sense of like isolation.
Yeah,
because he's really alone there, helpless.
Yeah, the mysophobic. I guess that's the new word I learned. The germ phobia. But what's interesting, and this might be totally wrong on my part, but like that episode did not resonate with me 30 years ago when I saw this. That episode totally resonated with me now. Why? Because this whole idea of a panic room, this whole idea that the people out there are breathing air that's killing them. You know, just think about China and what they're saying about how many people die here because of the pollutants, and our whole question of the environment and what we're doing to ourselves. And then this movement to kind of remain healthy, right? And this idea that he's doing that shake, and there's this weird moment where that seems actually so much more plausible to me 30 years later than it seemed, like you said, nightmarish in isolation in 82. It seemed to me a little bit like, wow, like the panic room, the whole thing. This seems like kind of where our culture has come to as a logical extension of so many of those early fears seated in the 70s and 80s around the apocalypse that we're existing in, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, that episode really freaked me out when I first saw it in the 80s because my initial experience with cockroaches was in a room that was just flooded with them. I was visiting a guy who was like in an apartment building, and he had just bug bombed it. So he's got plastic across the floor, and every time you step, it's crunching because there were just so.
Oh. Are you there, Paul?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, you're back.
Just telling my network is experiencing difficulties.
Area.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people love that story the best, and I can see. I'm watching this many years later. I can see why. I mean, there's some there. It has the Tom Savini special effects, kind of inspired by Alien, where the cockroaches crawl out of various orifices of the body, and then they bust out of the chest. So it's playing on that. I don't think the special effects are particularly good, but I mean, I can see that in terms of. But for me, one of the interesting things about that movie too is, about that episode too, is the stock market and like the technology, and how like what comes with this misophobia or whatever you want to call it is this notion of OCD, this notion of wealth, this notion of power, this notion of, like the mark. I mean, it's interesting how that whole thing kept together, and what in 1982 seemed like a super sci-fi room was all white, almost like George Lucas's THX 1138 or something. It's just, it's a moment, like it's a testament to that moment in time, which is interesting to me because one of the things that King says in Tales of the Hook is that horror is not it's not symbolic. In other words, like he tries to make the argument in that second chapter, Tale of the Hook, that, for all we try and read into horror for its kind of significance and its symbolic and its notions of beauty, he doesn't see that at all, right? Like for him, a horror is the kind of extension of the real, right? And an exaggeration of the real. And it often is a way for us to kind of cope with or deal with or come to terms with our moment in some difficult way, but not in notions of poetry or symbolic beauty or anything like that, but more with a kind of psychic ability to swallow, digest, make sense of our moment. And if you think about Walking Dead as an example of horror in our moment, I mean, that really does gel, right? Like with the apocalypse of our moment. And I think King is kind of making that argument in in Tail of the Hook. What do you think about that? Does that make sense in terms of his argument?
Yeah, yeah. I kind of like that thing too, that you brought up. That it's not, arty in the
Yeah.
horror stories. It's just, purely for your reaction. And I think I was thinking about, The Shining, Kubrick's movie, because it really does have an artistic level to what's
Yeah.
going on there if you peel it back and really look at it. Maybe that's not something that was in King's novel. I never read it, so.
Well, King hated The Shining. Kubrick's The Shining. Hated it. He did with a passion. So much that he funded the remake of it for TV. That was terrible.
Yeah, well, I heard that Kubrick had this quote that you cannot make a great movie out of a good book. And King kind of took offense at that, So,
Well, it's interesting too because here's a direct quote from King from Tales of the Hook, that chapter. He says, "Horror in general, quote, offers no characterization, no theme, no particular artifice. It does not aspire to symbolic beauty." And it's interesting. I mean, it's an interesting kind of argument that I would argue that you can see characterization in King's characters, but maybe not in the question of horror. Um, or themes maybe in the story, but not in this question of horror. So for him, horror is not necessarily the story, right? It's not where the story is going. It kind of breaks down into these kind of three levels that aren't particularly for him, beautiful or poetic. And I think that's where the Tale of the Hook comes in, right? Like
right, yeah.
he tells it as if it was a 13-year-old telling another 13-year-old as they were walking down the street to get bubble gum at the local stationery store about, hey, you hear this story about this guy, and then he goes in and he's going in a car with this woman and they're necking and then bop, 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 right? So it's
Yeah.
very interesting kind of take that's, like you're saying, very much pushing back against this question of, the intellectualization of horror.
Yeah, yeah. Although you think that the terror part, that is intellectual. It's the imagination, the psyche, psychology. So it's in there, but is that like symbolic, poetic beauty that you would associate with art? I don't think so.
Well, it's interesting because I think the most horrifying film ever made is The Shining. And that is very much an artistic rendering and an artistic beautification, if you will, of one of King's novels. So I do think that there is some tension within this statement, or within this kind of assertion that horror doesn't aspire to symbolic beauty.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Talking about art, something that also, you can see it in Creepshow is the way that it blends the world of cinema and the world of the comic book.
Yeah.
You have those like scenes at the end, where it sort of like dissolves into the illustration from the image, where the ghost zombie thing at the window turns from image into animation. And there are a couple of scenes. I pulled the shots. Let me find them. Like, for example, if we look at screen share. The
Yeah.
pumpkin there, you can see the frame sort of shows up like panels in a comic book. And there was another scene in here. So let's get that one up. where
Oh
they're
yeah.
physically drawing those lines and breaking it down into different scenes. So he's bringing that comic book world and the cinema world together.
Yeah, and that definitely works better in some episodes than others. I noticed in the episode of The Crate, they do it a lot. Whereas the episode of like the one with Stephen King and the meteorite, they do it very little. And same with the one with the cockroaches. Like it's done very
Yeah.
little. Another good example of that, and I have one on hand, is this one. This is the one with I Can Hold My Breath for a Long Time. And it's Leslie Nielsen, right? And
Yeah.
it's comic book behind him, but it's him, right? And it's actually fading into him becoming a drawn character. And I do like that. And it happens a lot at the end. So this is the very end of that episode. So you have that moment. Another little detail that I really like is that scene you talked about earlier on with Billy. Billy was the kid that was actually kind of cursing his father for throwing out his magazine, because that was the whole kind of interweaving plot. Is
Yeah.
Billy had this actual comic book called Creepshow that was the basis of these 5 stories, and it was actually a comic book that was made after the movie, and
Yeah.
it was illustrated by another artist, but it was the stories written by Stephen King, and they actually had it, and it looked a lot like those Tales from the Crypt, those EC comics. It was actually a knockoff of it. So this is a good example of this. Let's go to this on the desktop. This is going to be a look at not the I Can Hold My Breath for a Long Time, that's here, but the kid. I don't know if you remember this kid, but here he is. You see that?
Yeah.
And then you have the kid, and he's like, I'm going to take care of my dad. And then you have that really bad animation, but then or actually really bad prop, which then turns into animation. And that was one of their ways of getting away with, a fairly low budget, right? They weren't working high budget. Romero classically, is known for shooting almost entirely in Pennsylvania outside of Pittsburgh, which was the case with this, and probably a fairly low budget. He got a decent budget. But the other thing is that kid is Stephen King's son, Billy King, which is a cool little detail.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we talked a little bit about like the horror hosts, the old witch and the crypt keeper. And you don't really see that element here, but the actual comic book itself frames the entire story and makes the transitions from one to the other. So
it absolutely. And they link to that, like with the ads. And when you go from that moment, say when it's the actual live action is going to comic, it will usually show you some of the text and some of the transition, which is classic of the EC comics, and then move on to the next story. The other thing I think you can lose some track of is, like, you have this distinct stories, right? You have these 5 distinct stories, and they are overlapping themes, and you can make connections across class, isolation, questions of helplessness. There's the elements of zombie, elements of kind of, rogue wealth, the business elite, like, who would look at everybody as bugs and cockroaches that they just want to kill, but then it's a revenge of the people in the working class. Like, you can read all into that. But the thing that's interesting is this is a classic way of telling distinct separate stories, right? Small stories that are manageable, and then they become an omnibus, right? Like they become an anthology or a short kind of session. And that's what EC Comics did, right? They got very small, manageable, very kind of easy to draw stories and put them together and sold them,
Yeah, like you bring up the little details that it shows in the transitions. Like there was one, it fades to the comic book, and then the page flips over, and you see like the letters to the editor.
Exactly. And it's got
at
the sand.
At the end, they're looking at I guess the garbage men are picking up the comic and look at the ads and they see, the ad for the voodoo doll, but the corner's missing because someone sent in for it already.
Exactly. They redeemed that one. And the thing too is, I don't know if it's because I'm a father now or what, but like the whole thing with Billy and his dad, when the dad hits Billy, and it's kind of a little rough, right? Because Billy finds the Playboy in his father's sock drawer, and there's this back and forth of like, you have your trash, I have my trash, and there's this whole odd kind of discussion about trash culture. And it's interesting too, because what in the 80s and 70s or even the 60s, what we would think of as a trash B movie like Night of the Living Dead, which is now considered one of the great classics of the genre, one of the best of the best. It's funny how trash culture transforms over 30 or 40 years into the culture of a moment. Like so much of what we're defining as trash now, like animated GIFs and lolcats, will be the culture of a moment, right? And so it's so interesting to me because, EC Comics, as we know, was probably the trashiest of trash culture in the 50s, so much so that they had a Senate committee that was going to try and basically link it to juvenile delinquency. Like this was the worst of the worst. And it's interesting that in 81, King and Romero are still drawing that parallel, talking about the trash culture. Like my parents would probably say, you're watching Creepshow? That's trash. You're watching The Shining? That's trash. You're doing this? That's trash. And so that weird kind of generational struggle there, while subtle and not too over the top, is interesting because it also points another, and it's totally King, points another kind of, for him, a knowingness around what everyone calls in my work trash or looks at my work as popular trash is actually going to be, the defining narratives of this cultural milieu. And it is, whether we like it or not. Like,
yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, when you talk about what's trash, if you look at there's a digital comics museum online and there's another similar site that has public domain stuff. So you can see the competition that EC had. And EC is really at a much higher artistic level, especially as far as the art goes in the stories. And I think that is what made it impactful. And that's what, got the Senate's attention, and I think, maybe King is doing lowbrow horror fiction, but he's actually a very good writer. And that's why the stories stand up. That's why they meant so much to everybody.
Yeah, and he does do thematics and characterization and all the things you say that isn't horror very well. So it is. It's an interesting thing. And I think it's interesting to start a class that's going to be, dealing with a whole series of stories and short stories like this and kind of omnibus like stories like this through the eyes of two of the masters, cinematically and fictionally. Now, some of the questions that will be raised, I think, as we move on and deal with different things is how do we understand horror? What in your context, say, a digital context 40 years later, right? We're not in a situation where we're dealing with VCRs and closed circuit cameras in the same way we were in 81 or 82. But there's interesting point, I think, from Tale of the Hook that one of the things that really struck me is how much time he spent on the Teenage Werewolf movie from the 50s. And why I was struck about that is, in his definition of horror and in his definition of what really scares us, right, or what's terrifying for us, is the kind of, how would you say, the normal gone amok, right? Like the idea of this teenager who still has his, varsity jacket on, who's grown all this hair, whose face has been distorted. And I think he analogizes that to someone who has really bad acne or someone who's obese. And this idea in his work of not only it being quotidian and practical and you can see it and it's totally imaginable, but it's just a kind of an extension or an extremity of what we understand as the normal. And I thought it was so interesting that for him, he traces this notion of horror for him back to that, back to these ideas of these teenage kids in the 50s who are seen as juveniles, as delinquents, as somewhat abnormal, and how that becomes, what we think of as just a prop or a trope, becomes, I think, symbolic, whether King likes it or not, of some of the deep tensions, pressures, and, psychic, problems of the time. So, I mean, I kind of both read with and against King at once.
Yeah, the things that are different, the outsider, it's the other is something to be afraid of, and not fitting in is something to be afraid of.
Absolutely. Like, what could be more horrible? And if you read King's work, a lot of it is that bully. Like, we've talked a lot now about bullies, right? And then bullying culture and cyberbully. Like, we've dealt with it in our internet course. I mean, that came up again and again and again. And if you read some of King's books, like there's this character, Brower, I think his name is. And God, this guy isn't just a bully. He's evil, right? And so, like, there's these characters that haunt these kids in their middle school years. And it was funny because when I was reading these books and I was in my teens, I could relate to that fear. Like, I could relate to it. Whether I was the bully or not is another question. But, like, I could relate to the idea of being deeply concerned, almost to a horrific level, with just things you had to face with in your just daily life. Whether it be your parental situation, whether it be going to school, whether it be, just what you're watching on TV and hearing on the news. And King always did a really good job of capturing that quotidian horror. I think that's why he is who he is, and that's why he's so amazing, at least in terms of capturing the popular imagination about what's horrific for a moment. Like Cujo, a dog.
Yeah.
A dog. Christine, a big dog, but Christine, a car. Right? Like, there's nothing fantastical about a car. I mean, even if a car is fantastic, it's a car.
Yeah. I was Stand By Me. That was a Stephen King story, right?
Absolutely. An amazing one.
I was watching that a few weeks ago, and the scene that jumped out at me is like the two little kids come out of the corner store and the big kids are bullying them.
Exactly.
Kiefer Sutherland drops one of the kids to the ground and is threatening to put a cigarette out in his eye, and that is seriously horrible. And that is a thing that kids do,
Exactly.
threaten to do, at least. Because I actually saw that happen when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he talks about monsters in that, and you think, like, who is the monster there? It's the kid, the bully,
And if you think about Stand By Me, one of the other moments that's amazing is the revenge narrative in the story that is told when, the big heavyset kid eats all the possible pies he can and then drinks castor oil with the idea that he's going to throw up on everyone in the audience. And it's a really interesting revenge story. But all this on the way, right, to visit the body of a kid who had gotten hit by a train and died near the tracks. And it's kind of, one of the kids heard from their brother that's where it was. So it's interesting that that's the body written under, the name of the story was The Body, and it was written under his pen name, which I usually know, but I'm forgetting right now.
Bachman?
Bachman, that's right, Richard Bachman. And the idea was that those stories, if you read his Bachman stories, and there's different seasons, which has 4 of them, they're really good, but they're actually not so much based in the horror as they are as based in these real situations. One is about an abortion. Another is about a class shooting, where a kid gets up and shoots, in this classroom, which is really close to home. And a fourth one is about the Bataan Death Walk. But it's a Bataan Death Walk that comes home to Boston. So you have to walk. It's a crazy narrative. You have to walk at least 300 miles, right? And if your pace ever falls underneath 4 miles an hour, you're shot. That's it. And so like it's a race, and there's only one person who'll make it. And the same happened in Bataan, I guess. If you fell behind, it just kills you. So this whole idea of him taking these real moments, real horrors, and just weaving a kind of twisted narrative around it really comes out in the Bachman Tales.
Yeah.
Now I want to go do what? Walk 4 miles an hour.
Watch more Stephen King.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. It's just interesting to me, and I know we should probably wrap up, but it's just interesting to me that there's this marriage between King and Romero, and rather than it being what you would expect, right? Like hardcore horror novelization, great writing, and not that it isn't, but it becomes this comic play on something that you imagine both of them were really inspired and were kind of adoring of, was these EC comics, right? Was this whole strange little subculture amongst kids of the 50s and 60s, and imagine into the 70s, around this whole comics, because those comics were goofy too. They weren't just terrifying. Yeah, they were kind of like playing on different characters. They were beautifully drawn. But they weren't necessarily just straight up trying to scare the pants off you, right?
Yeah, because, the Crypt Keeper and their introductions with the crazy puns and stuff. Yeah,
exactly.
There's always that gallows humor throughout them. So, and sometimes I guess it went over the top too with that, but yeah. Yeah, because it surprised me kind of the extent to which they played that whole thing for laughs, but that does come out of the EC tradition. So
yeah. Absolutely. And the idea that, like, I mean, I think the idea of the relationships between comedy and horror is worth kind of thinking about a little bit, right? Like, they each play deeply on some of our expectations and some of our kind of darkest emotions, right? Like, and I think it's interesting how this one is a nice crossover, dark comedy, not easy to do.
Yeah, it shows there's lots of ways that it can go, right?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, and we've seen in prior versions of ds106, when people start doing their stories and creating their narratives, like we had last semester with Noir 106, like they did marry often the narrative, like the hardcore, gangster narratives, with the comedic to great effect.
Yeah. Or thinking back to Wire 106, where they looked at the physics of the whole thing, the science behind it. It's not a take that would have even occurred to me, but there's all different ways that we can look at these stories and interpret them.
Yeah. All right. Well, Paul,
that's our week 1 talk for Creepshow and Tales of the Hook. All right. DS106. For life. All right.